Good morning, folks. We're going to be wrapping up some material in Logic and Contemporary Rhetoric's Chapter 1. This first chapter is an overview of plenty of things you should have in your databanks. We've recently been talking about deduction and induction and some of those fundamental differences. We talked about the fact that logic is not relativistic. Next, the author introduces us to two concepts that there are some questions in the textbook about, concerning what the author refers to as background beliefs and worldviews. Now, one question I'm going to address here is what are they and how are they connected? Now, simply put, your background beliefs are your opinions, points of view, and so forth that have unsurprisingly been derived from your past experiences. What you believe is it is a product of your influences. Thus, what you are likely to accept as true or false will be contingent upon what you already accept to be true and false. Now, worldviews, the author used another word for worldviews. He said worldviews or philosophies. Now, folks, when he talks about your philosophy, he is using the word philosophy in a colloquial sense, not its literal sense. In its literal sense, philosophy means the love of wisdom. Now, you may have heard a person use a phrase like this. I hate this phrase. My philosophy on X is this. Now, what the person who says that really means is my view or my opinion is this. Now, when we speak of our philosophies on things, the author says this is similar to what we call our worldviews. I like to call our worldview something like the big lens through which we interpret reality, interpret value judgments, and so forth. Your worldview will indeed be a sort of conglomerate of your many background beliefs. Your worldview will be something that is shaped over time. Once it is made concrete, your worldview is something that is very difficult to alter. Because in a sense, your worldview defines who and what you are. And it will define how you, how you are likely to interpret new information, or perhaps even deny new information out of hand, simply because it goes against your worldview. Now, one of the reasons why thinking about your worldview critically matters is because your worldview will reflect what new information you're likely to reject out of hand. That is, that you aren't even likely to take seriously, simply because of what you already believe. Your worldview can get in the way of intellectual growth and development. Now, I don't like to use the word bias because I think it's so oftentimes misused, but I'll use it anyway. Yeah, indeed, your worldview is likely to bias you for or bias you against certain new pieces of information that come along, whether you should or you shouldn't. Now, does everyone have a worldview? Oh, absolutely. It's inescapable. Now, two of the things that the author, before I get there. The author goes for the proverbial low-hanging fruit when giving an example of something that is a fundamental piece of many people's worldview. That example was, of course, what? Anybody? For many people, their religion is one of the major elements of their worldview. And there's a reason for this. It's oftentimes something that people are brought up in. So it becomes just part of the fabric of your beliefs about reality. You're kind of sometimes taught to believe it rather than to be skeptical about it. And here's another reason why it's a major piece of people's worldview. Worldviews, according to those who develop this concept, are things that, or I should say, it is a frame or system of understanding that has answers to a whole lot of very difficult questions. Who am I? Why am I here, and how did I get here? What kind of life should I live? Am I best understood as a physical, material thing, or am I a spiritual thing? Where am I going after I punch life's final time clock? In other words, these are big questions that a lot of people understandably care about. For many people, their religion answers a lot of these questions for them. Or whatever your worldview is will answer a lot of these questions for you. This is one of the reasons why your worldview is oftentimes very fundamental to who you are. And why, if a new piece of information that goes against your worldview comes along, you're more likely to defend your worldview and reject the new piece of information than you are to, oh yeah, I'll accept this new piece of information and reject the entire system of belief that you've held your entire life. Your worldview is not the one that's likely to give. What's likely to give will be the new piece of information. You'll say, I think that statement is false, whether it's false or not. I hope I made that fairly clear. Everyone's got a worldview, and it's probably a good idea to have some kind of rational awareness of what the major facets of your worldview are. Because not only will you understand yourself and your own approach to looking at the world better, you might also understand a little better why psychologically you are prone to reject certain viewpoints out of hand because they go against your worldview. Now, the author talked about two vital kinds of background beliefs. The first one, he says, are views about human nature. Indeed, if you happen to believe that humans are basically decent, you're likely to approach the world in a particular way. If you think the worst of people, you're likely to approach the world in a different way. Or if you think that human nature is malleable and predictable, you might approach humans and human relationships differently. Now, I'll just speak for me. I would say that I consider my account of human nature to be realistic. You can agree to disagree with me there. But I tend to be fairly cynical about human motivations. I tend to think that people brought up in societies that teach them that money's the most important things, and looking out for number one ought to be your top priority. It's understandable why I'm not terribly trusting of people. Because I understand very frequently people are out to take my billfold. I don't mean it like pickpocketing or anything. But I'm a little bit cynical about human beings. Now, of course, some of the philosophers who I've read have also kind of corroborated this cynicism for me. And maybe I actually held those points of view first, and then I was looking for confirmation. You know how it goes. We are confirmation biased creatures fairly frequently. Rather than going where the data leads, we sometimes do go out and look for intellectual support that confirms what we already believe. That's not an intellectually good practice, by the way. It's a bad thing. Now, the other thing the author talks about, background beliefs about the sources that we tend to trust. Now, indeed, and I'll go on record saying this, I would say in the 21st century, many Americans have already replaced their traditional religion with politics. I have some extended family members, they talk about how much they love God and all this kind of stuff, and if you talk to them enough, you find out that their real allegiance isn't to God, it's to the Republican Party. I know some dyed-in-the-wool Dems who kind of do the same thing. But in other words, their devotion to their particular politics has become kind of like a surrogate religion. And by the way, far more intelligent scholars have already said this before me, even though I've been saying this for 20 years. But yeah, there's been research on stuff like this fairly recently. Now you'll notice that if you happen to be of a particular political persuasion, your people may have told you that certain sources of information are biased so left-wing or biased so right-wing, and so forth. Well, guess what? If you happen to think that one source is the enemy, you're likely to reject that source out of hand, no matter what the content is. And I don't want to get ahead of myself too much here, but I think this example is very apt for what I'm talking about. There has been research since the mid-1980s on a phenomenon called the hostile media effect. Has anyone heard of the hostile media effect? It incorporates several sub-theses, but among its theses are that individuals with their particular backgrounds are likely to see them and their camp as the lone voices of reason in a hostile universe, and they are more likely to see mainstream factions as against them. Now, a sub-thesis of this is that if they believe that a particular source has a particular slant against their perspective, they not only will automatically call bias on it, but they will automatically think that it's false. Now, what's interesting, and many studies have been done on this, they can show people the very same media clip, and strong partisans, one way or the other, will claim that the media is biased against their side, even though they're watching what? They're watching the very same clip. So this sort of leads to the question, how much of perceived bias is actually in the eye of the beholder? There have been a lot of other interesting studies, and this one's just too funny to let go. What they did, what the researchers did, was they understand that there's plenty of people who are more on the Dem side who think that Fox News is basically like a propaganda arm for the Republican Party. And there are my conservative friends who think that the New York Times is a communist paper, which kind of makes me laugh. I'm like, communist papers, we don't have those in the United States. But it just kind of shows you where the, where people's perceptions are. Now, one of the things that they did in this study was they actually took the actual newspaper clippings or the news clips, or rather the TV clips, and they mislabeled intentionally the sources they came from. People didn't cry bias based upon the actual content of the sources. Strong partisans had a tendency to say, it's in the New York Times, therefore it's biased towards the Democrats, and take a guess what it came from. Well, instead, they took it from the Washington Times. which tells me they may not have even read the piece. They may have just what? They may have just assumed that a source was biased because they were what? They have been told that certain sources are biased. Yeah, people have this tendency just to reject information out of hand simply because of the source that it came from. And that's a dangerous trend. It's not new either. Simeon.
Is that a form of investigation?
Well, to some extent, I might call it something that relies in part on authority. If somebody has told you that a particular source of information is biased against your side, and you take that for granted, you are trusting someone else's opinion. Now, admittedly, if you have done a whole lot of exploring and you find out, yeah, this is an anarchist rag, well, indeed, it might be an anarchist rag. But simply because it's an anarchist rag doesn't mean that there might not be true information in it. Yeah. Don't write a source off simply because of a perception of its being, biased against your side. Because indeed, the information might not be false. You might doubt the spin, that's understandable. But yeah, be wary of writing information off simply because of what the source is. Now, before we go, folks, I have a couple last things to say about what the author called science to the rescue. Now, keep in mind, one of the reasons why the author says that some people tend to be cynical or at least skeptical about science and the scientific enterprise is because in some cases, the findings of science challenge some people's worldviews. Now, if it challenges your worldview, you might decide to preserve your worldview rather than to accept the science that might challenge your worldview. Some people are also cynical about science because they see that the truths of science sometimes change. The author says, wait a minute. Simply because things change isn't necessarily a bad thing. If new studies and new findings come along, being able to revise your positions is not a negative, it's actually a virtue. By the way, science actually doesn't teach an ideology either. What science actually teaches is a method of getting to the truth. Now, please take a look at it if you haven't. But the author includes in the textbook as one of the exercises a science knowledge quiz from the Pew Research Center. By the way, it is similar to an earlier one that I've seen. As a matter of fact, I heard one of the original ones back in the 1990s, so this is going way back. It was from the National Science Foundation. They had similarly easy questions, in my estimation. And if you looked at the findings, it shows that a large number of regular Joe six-packs get the science basics wrong. And what's particularly daunting for me is it's in the format of either true and false questions or multiple guess questions. True and false questions I always find a little bit dubious anyway, because you have a 50-50 chance of getting it right, whether you know it or not. So it's scary that people get these basics wrong. The battle cry here is you're better off maybe not embracing everything about science, but the methodology of science. Because it can oftentimes enable us to find out things that we didn't previously think that we can know. Cheers.